Hello all. This is our second lecture in week 4. This lecture is going to focus on World War II. And you may notice that we're not really going to discuss the Great Depression in our class. That's not because it's not important, but it's just not going to fit in as well with our topic. Um, I'm going to briefly mention the New Deal in this, but if you have questions or you're uncertain, please let me know. I can always recommend sources that you can look at outside of our class to kind of catch up on some of the background history. So there's the time in between the world wars was generally seen deceptively as it seemed peaceful, but on the surface. But the reality was, it was not peace and poverty or peace and prosperity for everyone before the Great Depression. The 1920s is often called the Roaring Twenties. But the reality was, for farmers and for a lot of minorities, it was not a good time, and it was already starting to feel the bite of what would become the Great Depression. Farmers especially felt that long before the more urban areas. So the New Deal is problematic because it continues a policy of segregation, which will continue even through World War II. So World War II, it starts with the invasion of Poland in 1939. America involvement doesn't happen until after Pearl Harbor. Between the wars, there was continued discrimination, and at the start of World War II, you see that too. So initially, for example, the Red Cross would not accept African American donations. And there's a continued practice of last hired, first fired. And that's a common term when discussing African American work, especially in the urban area, because what it means basically is they were usually the last to be hired. So only after they were able to use as many white applicants as possible, and then they were usually the first hired, they could be let go, even if they had more seniority than a white person. And even as the wartime industries begin to ramp up, for example, North American Aviation president said that we will not employ Negroes. And he made that statement in a very straightforward manner and said that they would not be, even with the increase, be hiring African Americans. So in 1941, A. Philip Randolph, who we didn't get to talk about a lot, but he's an important civil rights activist during this period, including helping to organize one of the first African American unions before the war. He plans a march on Washington, and Roosevelt is very concerned about that because he really needs things to kind of look good and the support of the African American population. So with this pressure of the March on Washington, basically what they do is they compromise an Executive Order 8802, whereas it is the policy of the United States to encourage full participation in national defense programs by all citizens of the United States, regardless of race, creed, color, or national origin, in the firm belief that the democratic way of life within the nation, cannot be defended successfully only with the help and support of all groups within its borders. And that's just the opening paragraph of the executive order. You'll find with executive orders they tend to be long, so I'm not necessarily going to read all of them to you guys. And basically what they're doing is he's establishing that there is not to be discrimination within wartime industries. It also establishes the Fair Employment Practice Commission, which was to investigate issues of discrimination. But unfortunately, it has no real enforcement powers, and in the end, it makes very little impact in the discrimination that African Americans felt during World War II. But it is at least the president publicly saying that this is not acceptable. So there are clearly, as you know, during World War II, there are segregated armed forces. So Dory Miller's story is often well known. He was at Pearl Harbor, and he made some really heroic efforts to first carry off injured people and then to shoot with a gun at the Japanese that he had never even been trained on. In reward, he was rewarded with the Navy Cross and promoted to mess attendant first class. So what's interesting about Dory Miller's stories, it's kind of emblematic of the African American experience, is that, you know, even when shown very valiant, the rewards were small. He didn't, you know, he didn't necessarily receive what would have been right. So women, some other areas of discrimination, WAVE, or Women Accepted for Volunteer Service, which was the United States Naval Reserve for Women, did not accept African American women until the final year of the war. Army and Naval Nurse Corps did not accept African American women until 1944, and then only because Roosevelt was pressured to intervene on their behalf. There's a lot of problems with racial incidents. So July 1944, there was, and this is just as I'm going to give an example of them. July 1944, there was a ship that exploded. It killed 320 men, 202 of which were ammunition loaders who were only African American. Then they blamed the African Americans for the explosion and absorbed the white officers who had been in charge of all blame, even though the officers themselves had ignored safety commands and had placed bets on which crew could load their area the fastest. So it could load the crew with the most. So it's fairly certain that they were not being safe in safety procedures. So the crew actually cleaned up the debris, which included human remains, but then they refused to work without new safety procedures, and that's really all they were asking for, is that they didn't want to see this happen again, that they were certain it was not something that necessarily they had done, but that had been unsafe. They were eventually forced to return work under threat of the charge of mutiny and possible death by firing squad. And in the end, 50 refused to work and were actually charged with mutiny. So there was, even though these men are clearly serving our country, they were not respected and seen equally at all. There are positives in World War II. There's the Tuskegee Airmen, which many of you may be familiar with. They flew more than 15,000 missions during World War II. And also the Battle of the Bulge. So African Americans were primarily, even when they were accepted within the military forces, were usually put on kind of menial tasks. So they were, and we saw this since the Civil War, they were not necessarily allowed frontline duty. They were put in trench digging and cooking and other menial tasks. But by 1944, in the Battle of the Bulge, they helped to propel the last German counteroffensive. So, much like with World War I, they were turned away, their help was turned away until Americans started getting injured, and then they become a higher portion of the inductees. So another thing that goes on during World War II is the Double V campaign. And the goal of that, the kind of slogan of that is democracy, victory at home, and victory abroad. And it was started by Pittsburgh Courier, which was an all African American newspaper, and it was started in 1942. And basically, their concern was to see that what happened with World War I did not happen again. So, African Americans valiantly served in a segregated force during World War I and came home to find their rights no better than before they'd left. In fact, in some ways, they were worse. I mean, if wearing your military uniform as an African American could get you lynched. It definitely got you harassed. And we're talking about, like I said, men who served our country. So it's really important that we understand that African Americans wanted to see a different outcome with World War II. And what they argued was that they wanted to help the war effort. They wanted to unite to secure democracy, but they wanted real democracy. So in 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt got together and they came up with what they called the Atlantic Charter. Now, it was not an actual governing body, but it was a statement of ideas that they wanted to see, both of their countries wanted to see come out of World War II. So no aggrandizement, territorial or other. People were concerned that after World War I, there was a lot of territory grab, and that was part of the reason for World War II. No territorial changes that do not accord with freely expressed wishes of the people concerned. So a lot of these points are about self-government, the idea that we should let people decide what their nation is and who will govern their nation after World War II. The right to self-govern, the right restored to any that it's been removed from, access by all states on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity. And that's really supposed to be a statement kind of against colonialism, because what colonialism often did is raw materials were hoarded by whichever country was in charge. Collaboration between nations to secure for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. So, some of this is about a higher standard of living for the international community. After the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hope to establish a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety with their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all men in the lands they may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. That such persons should enable all the traverse the high seas and oceans without hindrance. So one of the things that happened before World War II is that even before America got involved, that their ships were commandeered. So that's what they're referring to. They believe that all of the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, since future peace cannot be maintained if land cannot be maintained in sea or air. Armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers. They believe, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of nations is essential. They will likewise aid and encourage all of the practical means that will light for peace-loving people the crushing burdens of armaments. And basically what they're talking about is an international community that will protect each other. And this idea that if there is this international community, then there won't be need for armaments. We won't need so many weapons. And this Atlantic Charter becomes the basis of the United Nations, which is still today. So what African Americans are saying is, we don't enjoy all the rights and privileges that you've set forth in the Atlantic Charter. We don't live without fear or want. There's a lot of fear and want in our communities. We want you to mean what you say in the Atlantic Charter. We want democracy for all, including at home. And that's what the Pittsburgh Courier starts arguing for. And I think that they were almost shocked at the response they got. There's several. So, that there's an outpouring of letters from soldiers, from civilians, from people talking about their experiences of segregation and how they want to see democracy not only abroad but at home. There's actually a great book. I did not listen to my reference section because they didn't really use it in my lecture. But if any of you are interested, it's called Taps for a Jim Crow Army, and it's letters from black soldiers during World War II. It's written by Philip McGuire, and it's basically an edited collection of letters from soldiers talking about their experience during World War II. So 82% of the Pittsburgh Courier did believe that did not believe that African American leaders about freedom and equality for all people, including the American Negro. So basically, during this period, clearly they need African American support for World War II, and they're saying that there's going to be freedom and equality for all, and the Atlantic Charter, as I said, has the same rhetoric, where it's talking about freedom and equality, but 82% of the Pittsburgh Courier readers did not believe that that was actually going to happen. Many supported the idea like Mahatma Gandhi did. What Mahatma Gandhi did basically was he said he would not support World War II and the Allies unless the British would remove their rule from India. And he stood firm by that. And many people wanted African Americans to do that. In the end, I think that most people were concerned about Hitler. There's comments made that Hitler would be worse than what we already have. So I think that's why that avenue was not explored, and they focused on the double V, victory at home and victory abroad. So also during World War II is the Second Great Migration. It's also based around wartime industry. And it's in some ways larger than the World War I migration, even though it's usually not as talked about. So close to 5 million African Americans between 1941 and the late 1970s left the South to move to the North and the West. And that's important because that's a huge population shift. It affected the South in a loss of labor, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture. It affects the North in an influx in the cities. And yet, even though, there is clearly, again, this recruiting, this yes, we need labor, at the same time, African Americans are experiencing small gains. So from 1942 to 1945, there's only a 5% raise. So it goes from 3% to 8% of African Americans that are employed in the wartime industries during World War II. So that's less than the proportion of the population, the 8%. So even at its height, the employment of African Americans in wartime industry doesn't even amount to the same proportion as African Americans were a part of the population. So just in conclusion, once again, much like I discussed in my World War I lecture, African Americans do experience some limited opportunity during World War II. They do experience some new industrial jobs that they had not experienced before. And there is a second Great Migration where there's a large movement to the North again for these jobs. However, once again, the opportunities are limited, and there's still a small population that actually receives that. The defense industry is still hired in a limited manner, but there were even opportunities for African American women who had previously only really been in domestic industries. World War II is much more changing of the home front than previous World War. and they still experience extreme discrimination in the military, being forced into menial positions, sometimes not even allowed. The Double V campaign is important because it pushes harder. And they basically said we didn't get what we needed at the end of World War I, and we are going to push harder. And many argue that this is a foreshadowing and that this is the start of the civil rights movement that we're going to discuss. This is my reference slide. As I said, I do not have it on here, but if you're interested and you want to email me so I can send you exact publisher information, Taps for a Jim Crow Army is one of my favorite books. It's really enjoyable to read those primary sources, which are actually African Americans talking about what their war experience is like, and that's so important. So thanks guys for listening. Have a great week.